My name is Margaret Ellis. I'm 68 years old, a retired schoolteacher, and a widow. I thought the toughest days of my life had passed when my husband died 20 years ago. I raised two children on my own, working double shifts, cutting every corner, saving every penny, just to make sure they had a life better than mine. For decades, I was their rock, their safety net, their home. But one evening, as we sat around the dinner table that I had paid for, in the house that I had built with my late husband's savings, I heard something that shattered me in a way war, poverty, and grief never could. My own family, the very people I had sacrificed everything for, called me a parasite. It was my granddaughter, only 12 years old, who said the word out loud. She looked straight at me, giggled, and whispered it like a joke. "Grandma's just a parasite." The room went silent. My daughter laughed nervously, my son-in-law smirked, and nobody corrected her. Nobody defended me. In that moment, something inside me broke. But I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I didn't even raise my voice. Instead, I smiled, quietly, almost invisibly. Because what they didn't know was that I had already begun preparing for this day. You see, while they thought I was weak, old, and dependent, the truth was entirely different. Every bill in that house, I paid it. Every grocery trip, every repair, every unexpected expense, they all came from my pension, from the savings I never spent on myself. When my daughter wanted a car, I co-signed the loan. When my son-in-law lost his job for 6 months, I covered their mortgage. And when they bought this very house, it was my money that made the down payment possible. And yet, they dared to call me a parasite. That night, I excused myself from the table and went to my room. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the walls I had painted, the furniture I had purchased, the very roof over their heads that I had secured. And I thought to myself, if they believe I'm a burden, perhaps it's time they learn what life looks like without me. Because here's the truth, I wasn't the parasite. I was the host. And without me, everything they took for granted would soon come crashing down. So I stayed silent. I kept smiling. But inside, I had already made a decision. And that decision would change everything. I grew up in a small town in Ohio. My parents were simple people. My father worked in a steel factory, and my mother was a homemaker. Life was never luxurious, but it was full of love. When I married my husband, Daniel, we built our dream slowly, one brick at a time. He was a kind man, hardworking, the kind of person who believed in family above everything. We didn't have much, but we had each other, and that was enough. When Daniel passed away suddenly from a heart attack, my world collapsed. My children were still young, my daughter only 13, my son barely 9. I remember standing in the kitchen after the funeral, staring at the bills piling up, wondering how on earth I was going to do this alone. But quitting wasn't an option. So, I went back to teaching full-time and took on tutoring in the evenings. For years, I woke up at dawn, packed lunches, walked my kids to school, taught a full day of classes, and then rushed across town to tutor other people's children just to make ends meet. I can still remember those nights when I would come home past 9 o'clock, exhausted to the bone, only to find my kids waiting at the table with their homework, needing my help. And I helped. Every night, no matter how tired I was, because they were my reason for pushing forward. We lived modestly. No fancy vacations, no designer clothes. But I always made sure they had enough. Birthdays were special, Christmas mornings were magical, and every achievement of theirs felt like proof that my sacrifices meant something. When my daughter graduated high school, I sold Daniel's old truck, the last thing of his I truly cherished, just so I could help pay for her college tuition. When my son got into sports, I worked extra shifts to afford his equipment. I denied myself new clothes, new furniture, even medical checkups, because their needs always came before mine. And for a long time, I believed it was worth it, because my children loved me. They would hug me tight, whispering, "Mom, we'd be nothing without you." Those words carried me through sleepless nights and empty bank accounts. They were my anchor. When they both grew up, I thought my role as the struggling provider was finally over. My daughter got married, my son moved out, and I believed my sacrifices had given them the foundation for a stable life. I imagined holidays together, family dinners, grandchildren playing in my lap. I pictured myself as the proud matriarch of a family that knew what it meant to stand together. And for a little while, it seemed that dream was real. My daughter would bring her children to visit. My son-in-law treated me kindly at first. I'd cook big dinners, watch the grandkids while they worked, and I felt useful. I felt needed. But slowly, things began to change. It started with little comments, my daughter sighing that money was tight, my son-in-law hinting that the mortgage was overwhelming. I offered to help, of course. I dipped into my savings, used my pension checks, even sold some of my jewelry to keep their bills paid. "Just until you're back on your feet," I would say. And they promised me it was temporary. But temporary became permanent. Soon, they weren't asking politely. They were expecting. When the electric bill came due, it was handed to me without hesitation. Groceries became my responsibility. Every school expense for my grandchildren landed on my lap. I didn't complain, because I thought, this is what family does. We help each other. What I didn't realize was that the balance had shifted. I was no longer the respected mother who had carried them through the storm. I had become the invisible wallet, the automatic solution to every problem. And the more I gave, the less they seemed to value it. The grandchildren I adored grew used to seeing me as the woman who bought them toys, snacks, and clothes. My daughter stopped saying thank you. My son-in-law began to look at me not as a blessing, but as an obligation. And then came the whispers. One afternoon, as I was folding laundry, I overheard my daughter on the phone. She said, "I don't know how much longer we can deal with her. She's always around, always inserting herself. She doesn't understand that this is our house now." Our house. The same house my pension had paid the down payment for. Still, I kept quiet. I convinced myself that maybe it was just stress, that maybe they didn't mean it. Families go through hard times, after all. I told myself that as long as I was useful, as long as I was helping, they would eventually appreciate me again. But the truth was, the more I gave, the more invisible I became. And I didn't know it yet, but the moment of betrayal, the moment that would shatter the illusion completely, was just around the corner. After that phone call I overheard, something inside me shifted. I stopped looking at my daughter and son-in-law the same way. I still helped, I still smiled, but now I started noticing things I had been blind to before. I began to see how quickly the bills were shoved into my hands the moment I walked through the door. I noticed how my daughter avoided eye contact when I asked about her job, or how my son-in-law would conveniently disappear whenever a repairman came by, leaving me to deal with the costs. One evening, I caught my daughter looking through my purse. When she saw me, she pretended she was just moving it to a safer spot. I wanted to believe her, but a part of me knew better. Then came the first real crack. My pension card went missing for 2 days. I turned the house upside down, panicking, until suddenly it reappeared on the kitchen counter. No one admitted to touching it, but the balance on the account told me money had been withdrawn, without my permission. That night, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. For the first time in my life, I felt like a stranger in my own family. I told myself I would let it go, but deep down, a small voice whispered, "Watch closely. Something isn't right." So I did. I started paying attention to the small details, the hushed conversations behind closed doors, The sudden silence when I entered the room, the way my name was mentioned like I wasn't standing right there. I noticed how my granddaughter, the same little girl I used to rock to sleep, now rolled her eyes whenever I spoke. How my grandson mimicked the way his father sighed whenever I asked a question. Children don't learn cruelty on their own. They learn it by watching the adults around them. One afternoon, I overheard my son-in-law on the phone. He was in the living room, speaking quietly, but I caught enough. "Don't worry about her. The house will be ours soon anyway. It's just a matter of time." Those words sent a chill down my spine. The house was in my name. I had bought it, signed it, maintained it. Yet, in their eyes, I was temporary, a placeholder. Something to be tolerated until I died. From that day forward, I stopped seeing them as my family and started seeing them for what they were, opportunists waiting for me to disappear. The tension grew heavier with each passing week. Dinner conversations became colder. My daughter barely spoke to me except to ask for money. My son-in-law made jokes at my expense, about my age, my slowness, my forgetfulness. Every laugh from him felt like a knife. And still, I stayed quiet. Outwardly, I pretended nothing was wrong. But inwardly, I began keeping track. I started saving receipts, documenting every expense I covered. I wrote down dates, amounts, and the reasons they gave. I began keeping my pension statements hidden in a locked drawer. I even carried a small notebook with me, jotting down things I overheard, moments they revealed their true feelings. The more I watched, the more undeniable the truth became. They weren't just ungrateful. They were planning their lives around my death. The final straw came one night at exactly 2:07 a.m. I woke up to use the restroom when I noticed light coming from under the living room door. Quietly, I walked closer and heard my daughter and son-in-law talking. My daughter's voice was sharp, filled with frustration. "We can't keep waiting. She's stubborn. She won't just hand over the house." And then my son-in-law's reply, "Relax. Once she's gone, everything is ours. The kids will inherit, and we'll control it all." I froze in the hallway, clutching the wall for support. My own flesh and blood were sitting there, casually discussing my death like it was part of a financial plan. I didn't cry. I didn't storm in and confront them. Instead, I quietly walked back to my room, lay down, and stared at the ceiling until dawn. That was the night I stopped being blind. That was the night I decided if they wanted to treat me like a parasite, then I would show them just how much they depended on me. From that day forward, I became a silent observer. I stopped offering money unless they asked. I watched how quickly their patience wore thin when my help wasn't immediate. I paid attention to every cruel comment, every mocking laugh, every greedy glance. And each time, I stayed calm. I stayed quiet. Because while they thought I was weak, I was already building the strength to do what had to be done. The night I overheard them discussing my death should have been enough. But sometimes the heart refuses to believe what the ears already know. A part of me still clung to hope, still whispered, maybe they're just stressed. Maybe they don't mean it. That fragile hope shattered a week later. It was a Sunday afternoon, one of those rare days when everyone was home. I had cooked a big meal, roast chicken, mashed potatoes, and apple pie, just like Daniel used to love. I thought, maybe if I made something special, we could have one normal family dinner again. The food was barely on the table before the insults began. My granddaughter wrinkled her nose and said, "Why does Grandma always make old people food?" My daughter laughed. My son-in-law muttered under his breath, "She should be grateful we even let her stay here." I froze, fork halfway to my mouth. "Let me stay here." The words burned inside my chest. I wanted to shout, "This is my house. My money. My roof. Without me, you'd have nothing." But I stayed quiet. Then, in the middle of dinner, my granddaughter giggled and said it again. The word that had haunted me ever since. Parasite! This time, she didn't whisper it. She said it loud enough for everyone to hear. The table went silent. My daughter looked at her plate. My son-in-law smirked. Nobody corrected her. Nobody defended me. And that was the moment I knew. They didn't see me as their mother, their grandmother, their protector. They didn't see me as the woman who sacrificed her entire life so they could have theirs. To them, I was nothing but a burden. A wallet with gray hair. A body taking up space until it finally gave them what they wanted. Something inside me hardened. For years, I had cried in secret, swallowed insults, and convinced myself it was worth it because family meant love. But that day, as I looked around the table I had paid for, inside the house I had built, surrounded by people who saw me as disposable, I realized the truth. Family isn't just blood. Family is respect. And they had none left for me. I set my fork down gently. My hands were steady, though my heart felt like it was on fire. I looked at each of them, one by one. My daughter, avoiding my eyes. My son-in-law, smug with confidence. My granddaughter, still smirking like she had told the funniest joke in the world. I smiled. A small, calm smile. And in that moment, a thought came to me, clear as day. If they believe I'm useless, then it's time they learn the truth. Without me, they have nothing. And soon, they will see it. I excused myself from the table, carried my plate to the sink, and walked to my room. I shut the door, sat down on the edge of the bed, and stared at the papers I had kept hidden, the deed to the house, the bank statements, the pension records. Proof that everything they depended on was me. That night I didn't cry. I didn't beg. I started planning. The night I decided to stop being silent, I realized something. Revenge isn't about shouting, fighting, or throwing dishes across the room. Real revenge is quiet. It's calm. It's the kind of storm you don't see coming until it's already too late. So, the very next morning, I got to work. I started with the most important thing, the house. The same house my daughter and her husband kept referring to as theirs. What they didn't realize was that the deed was still in my name, fully and legally. They had no claim to it. I pulled the documents from my locked drawer and made copies. One set went into a safe deposit box at the bank. The other set I mailed directly to my lawyer, an old colleague's son I had known since he was a boy. When I called him, his voice was calm but firm. "Mrs. Ellis, you've been far too generous. It's time to protect yourself." Those words gave me strength. For the first time in years, I felt like I wasn't alone. The next step was my finances. For too long, I had been letting my pension automatically deposit into the joint account I shared with my daughter for family expenses. That ended immediately. I opened a brand new account at a different bank, moved my pension over, and left just enough in the old account to avoid suspicion. I also transferred my savings into a trust under my name only, something they could never touch. I didn't stop there. I called the utility companies and slowly began removing my payment methods from their bills. The electricity, water, internet, and gas, all of it had been running on my cards. Quietly, one by one, I canceled the autopays. Within weeks, those bills would start arriving in their names, unpaid, forcing them to realize just how much they had leaned on me. Meanwhile, I began documenting everything. Every insult, every cruel remark, every instance where they treated me as less than human. I wrote it all down, date by date, word by word. And when I could, I recorded their voices, especially the night I overheard them talking about my death. The audio was grainy, but clear enough to hear the venom in their words. At night, while they thought I was asleep, I researched. I learned about wills, trusts, and inheritance laws. I discovered exactly how to ensure that not a single penny of my estate would ever pass through their greedy hands. Instead, I made arrangements for charities, community programs, and even a scholarship in my late husband's name. If anyone was going to benefit from my sacrifices, it would be people who truly needed it, not those who mock me. Day by day, step by step, I built my plan. And all the while, I played the role of the quiet, helpless grandmother. I still cooked their meals, smiled at their jokes, and nodded when they called me names. They thought I was shrinking, fading away. But inside, I was growing stronger. One evening, my daughter came into my room, frustrated about money. "Mom, can you cover the credit card bill this month? We're a little short." I smiled gently, hiding the fire burning in my chest. "Of course, dear. Just leave it on the table." The next day, I paid the minimum balance. Not enough to keep them comfortable, but just enough to avoid suspicion. When the late fees piled up, they would never connect the dots back to me. Another time, my son-in-law complained about the mortgage. "This house is bleeding us dry," he muttered. I bit my tongue to keep from laughing. If only he knew the truth, that without me, they wouldn't even have that roof. Through it all, I stayed calm, patient. Because revenge isn't just about striking back, it's about timing. And I wanted my timing to be perfect. Weeks passed, and small cracks began to appear. The electricity company called about an unpaid bill. My granddaughter complained that her favorite snacks weren't in the pantry. My son-in-law grew irritable, snapping at my daughter more often. Slowly, their world was unraveling, and they didn't even realize I was the one pulling the threads. Finally, I sat down with my lawyer one last time. We went over the documents carefully, the will, the trust, the property deed. Everything was airtight, legally binding, untouchable. My lawyer looked at me and said, "When the time comes, they won't know what hit them." And I smiled, because that was exactly the point. For years, they had treated me as if I were invisible. But soon, they would see me more clearly than ever before. Not as a parasite, not as a burden, but as the woman who had held their entire world in her hands and chose to let it crumble. I walked out of that office feeling lighter than I had in decades. For the first time, I wasn't scared of the future. I was in control. They thought I would never fight back. But what they didn't know was that I had been preparing for battles my entire life. And this was one war I fully intended to win. It began quietly, almost too quietly for them to notice. The first sign was the electricity bill. My daughter frowned when she opened the envelope, muttering about how strange it was that it hadn't been paid yet. My son-in-law shrugged it off, saying it must have been some system error. I watched from my seat in the kitchen, sipping my tea, hiding my smile. The second sign came a week later, when the water company called. "Unpaid balance?" The voice on the other end said loud enough for the whole room to hear. My daughter's face went pale. My son-in-law cursed under his breath. They both looked at me, expecting me to jump in like I always did. But this time, I stayed silent. Soon after, the groceries began to dwindle. The refrigerator wasn't stocked with the usual snacks and treats. My granddaughter whined, asking where her favorite ice cream had gone. My daughter snapped at her, frustration etched across her face. Little by little, the walls of their comfort began to close in. Then came the breaking point. One evening, my son-in-law stormed into my room, holding a pile of unpaid bills in his hand. "What's going on, Margaret? You've been slacking. These are your responsibilities." I looked him straight in the eye and said softly, "No, they're not. Not anymore." The silence that followed was deafening. For the first time, he didn't know what to say. The next week, the bank called about the mortgage. Payments had been missed. My daughter panicked, begging me to cover it. I folded my hands calmly and said, I don't think that's my responsibility either. Their anger grew. Their voices grew sharper, their patience thinner. But I stayed calm, unshaken. And then, the moment arrived, court. They had tried to intimidate me, insisting that the house belonged to them, that I was just living here out of pity. What they didn't know was that my lawyer had already filed everything. The deed, the trust, the will. It was all in black and white, legal and binding. The day of the hearing, I walked into the courtroom with my head held high. My daughter and son-in-law sat across the aisle, smirking like victory was already theirs. But when the judge opened the file and began reading, their smirks faded fast. According to these documents, the judge said, the property is solely owned by Margaret Ellis. Furthermore, financial records indicate she has been the primary provider for all household expenses for the last 8 years. My son-in-law shifted uncomfortably. My daughter's face drained of color. And then came the moment I had been waiting for. I handed the judge a small USB drive. On it was the audio recording, their late-night conversation about my death, about how everything would be theirs once I was gone. The judge played it aloud in the courtroom. The words echoed in the silence. Relax. Once she's gone, everything is ours. The kids will inherit, and we'll control it all. Gasps filled the room. My lawyer leaned back, satisfied. The judge's expression turned cold. In that instant, the image they had tried to paint of me, as a burden, a parasite, crumbled to dust. The truth was undeniable. The judge banged his gavel. This court sees clear evidence of financial exploitation and elder abuse. Mrs. Ellis retains full ownership of her property and assets. The defendants have no claim. Case dismissed. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. I sat there, calm and composed, while my daughter buried her face in her hands. My son-in-law looked as if the ground had just disappeared beneath him. And I simply smiled. Because justice doesn't always come with fists or shouting. Sometimes it comes with silence, paperwork, and one perfectly timed revelation. When we walked out of the courthouse, my daughter tried to speak. Mom, please, we didn't mean it. We were just... I raised my hand to stop her. My voice was calm, steady. No, you meant every word. And now you'll live with the consequences. From that day forward, they were forced to face a reality without me. No money, no safety net, no roof they could call their own. Everything they had taken for granted was gone. And for the first time in decades, I felt free. The house was quiet again. Not the heavy, suffocating silence of tension, but the peaceful kind, the kind I hadn't felt in years. No footsteps stomping down the hall. No whispered insults behind closed doors. No giggles at my expense. Just quiet. After the court ruling, they had no choice but to leave. I watched from the porch as my daughter and her family packed their things. Suitcases stuffed, tempers flaring, faces darkened with shame. My granddaughter avoided my eyes, though I caught her wiping away angry tears. My son-in-law barked orders, like a man still trying to hold on to control, though we both knew it was gone. My daughter lingered the longest. She stood in the doorway, her eyes wet, her lips trembling. For a moment, I thought she might say she was sorry. But she didn't. She just lowered her head and walked away. And then, they were gone. For the first time in a long time, the house felt like it belonged to me again. Every corner carried memories of raising children, of laughter and birthdays and Christmas mornings. Those memories weren't ruined by the pain. If anything, they stood brighter, like little lights reminding me of who I truly was. A mother, a provider, a woman who had given everything she had. I wasn't a burden. I wasn't a parasite. I was the foundation. The days that followed were different. I woke up when I pleased, made myself breakfast, sat in the garden with a book. The roses I had neglected for years finally got my attention again. Their blooms came back, brighter than ever, as though they too were celebrating freedom. Neighbors stopped by, some curious, some supportive. Word had spread about the courtroom drama, and while I hated the gossip, I couldn't deny the quiet satisfaction of people finally knowing the truth. One kind neighbor even said, "You're stronger than any of us realized." I just smiled. But strength isn't about never breaking. It's about what you do after you've been broken. One evening, I sat by the window, watching the sun dip below the horizon, and I realized something. Revenge hadn't been the goal. Justice had. And justice had been served. My family had tried to reduce me to nothing, but instead, they lost everything they thought they controlled. As for me, I gained something far greater. My peace. I decided to set up a scholarship fund in Daniel's name, using some of the money they once tried to steal. "For children who respect their elders," I wrote in the mission statement. Because if my story had taught me anything, it was this: legacy should be built on love, not greed. I don't know where my daughter and her family went. Maybe they're struggling. Maybe they've moved on. I don't hate them. I don't even wish them harm. I simply wish they remember the day they lost everything, not because I was cruel, but because I finally chose myself. And if they ever sit at another table, mocking someone weaker, planning to take advantage of them, I hope my face flashes in their memory. The face of the woman they underestimated. Because in the end, I didn't need to raise my voice, or fight, or scream. I just needed to remind them that without me, they were nothing. And without them, I was free.